She was just a single mom who bought an abandoned church for $700. What she found locked away in its forgotten basement changed everything. Hidden for over a century, the secrets beneath the weathered walls reveal a secret society, cryptic symbols, and a legacy that still controls the town today. But when powerful families come knocking, claiming ownership, Clara must fight not just for history, but for the truth, what lies behind the iron door, and who will stop at nothing to keep it buried forever. Join us as we uncover the mysterious story of the Sacred Covenant of Millford and the battle to protect its hidden past. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The county courthouse basement smelled faintly of mildew and burnt coffee, a place where forgotten property and unpaid debts came to be sorted out under fluorescent lights. The rows of metal folding chairs were only half filled, most occupied by men in work boots and winter jackets, speaking in low tones about hunting leases or tax liens. A few women sat scattered among them, flipping through the stapled packets of auction listings, circling addresses that might yield a resale profit. No one looked at the item listed halfway down page 4. Millford Methodist Church to 214 Pine Street, sold as is. No warranty, structural assessment recommended. It had been printed in the same size font as everything else, but to Clara Mason, it stood out as if the page itself had leaned toward her. The auctioneer, a man with the careful detachment of someone used to disappointment, cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. Next, up Millford Methodist Church, tax forfeiture. Opening bid, $700. His voice echoed flatly against the cinder block walls. The murmur in the room barely shifted. A few heads turned toward the listing packet, but no hands went up. The word church carried no spark here. It meant drafty heating, roof leaks, and the kind of repairs that could drain a savings account before the first Sunday service. Clara sat near the back, her winter coat draped over the chair beside her, her fingers curled around the paper packet, tracing the line of text as though it might disappear if she didn't keep hold of it. She hadn't come for this. She had been here for something smaller, something manageable, an old storage shed. On the edge of town, that might become a workspace for her furniture refinishing jobs. But when the auctioneer's voice said Millford Methodist Church, she saw the building in her mind. The spire she passed every day on her walk to work. The way the stained glass caught the late afternoon sun, even through decades of grime. The boarded-up front doors that had never seemed quite ready to give up their story. $700 opening bid. Do I have his sentence hung in the stale air? Pens scratched on notepads. Someone coughed. A chair leg scraped against the floor. Clara's heartbeat had already picked up. She thought of Eli, her son, sitting at home doing homework at the kitchen table. They could barely fit in their rented duplex. 14 years old, and already old enough to know how narrow her margins were. They had no business buying a church. They had no business buying anything that couldn't pay for itself by the end of the month. But something about the silence in the room, the casual dismissal from the rest of the bidders, made the decision come from a place deeper than logic. Her hand went up before she could calculate the risk. 700, she heard herself say, though the words felt foreign in her mouth. The auctioneer's eyes flicked toward her, just long enough to register mild surprise. 700 from the lady in the back. Do I have 750? His gaze swept the room, but the room had already moved on in its mind. No one countered. No one even looked at her. 700 going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a muted crack against the woodblock. Sold. Clara let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The metal chair felt harder under her as she sat back, the sound of the gavel still echoing in her chest. A few people glanced her way, quick, curious looks that didn't linger. The man 2 seats over gave a low whistle, half amusement, half pity, as if to say she'd just inherited more trouble than she could handle. She didn't bother defending the choice. The decision had already settled into her bones like it had been waiting there for years. The clerk slid a manila envelope across the folding table toward her. When it was over, inside was a set of oversized iron keys, each one heavier than it looked, along with a receipt stamped paid in full. The keys clinked together with a sound that made her think of locked doors and the promisor, the threat of what lay behind them as she stepped out into the late afternoon cold. Snowflakes just beginning to drift from a low gray sky, Clara felt the weight of the envelope in her bag. She knew exactly where the church stood, could see its tilted spire in her mind. But what she didn't know no one in that room had cared to ask was why it had sat untouched for so long, or what had been left behind when the last door closed. She told herself she'd find out soon enough. The road to Pine Street narrowed the farther they walked, houses giving way to overgrown lots where rusted fences leaned under the weight of vines. The air had that damp, late-winter heaviness that made sound travel differently, each step on the cracked sidewalk echoing faintly between the empty buildings. Clara adjusted the strap of her canvas bag on her shoulder, feeling the oversized iron keys shift inside. Eli walked beside her, hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, who'd pulled low over his forehead. He hadn't spoken much since they left the bus stop, and she could tell by his sideways glances that he was waiting to see the thing she'd bought before deciding how he felt about it. The first glimpse of the spire came from half a block away, rising above the bare branches of an elm tree like the mast of a ship run aground. It leaned just enough to be noticeable, the kind of tilt that made you look twice to be sure it wasn't your imagination. As they drew closer, the rest of the building emerged weathered clapboard, siding once painted white, now stripped in. Long curling shreds by wind and time, the roofline sagged in places, shingles lifting at the edges like pages of a book that had been left out in the rain. The church sat on a small rise at the end of the street, its front steps choked with dead leaves and brittle weeds that had found their way up through cracks in the concrete. The double doors were tall and heavy, each fitted with panels carved in shallow relief. Whatever detail had once been there was dulled by layers of peeling paint. Above them, the arched stained glass window loomed what might once have been a scene of saints or angels now obscured by decades of grime and the spiderweb of cracks running through the colored panes. Only in one or two spots did the glass still catch the light, throwing a muted blue or red onto the weather-stained boards. Eli stopped at the base of the hill, his eyes scanning the length of the building. This is it. His tone wasn't exactly disappointment, but it wasn't approval either. This is it, Clara said, her breath visible in the cold air. She started up the uneven path that led to the steps, her boots crunching over gravel mixed with broken bits of plaster. The closer they got, the more details emerged: faded lettering above the door, where the church's name had once been painted. Rust streaks running down from the old iron hinges. A faint smell of damp stone seeping out from somewhere unseen. From the side, the church seemed to stretch farther back than Clara remembered. The sanctuary windows were tall and narrow, each framed in chipped trim. Some were boarded over from the outside, the plywood bleached gray by weather. The bell tower rose above the main roofline, its slatted openings dark and empty. The rope that once rang the bell no doubt frayed away years ago. A pair of pigeons startled from the eaves as they approached, the sudden flutter breaking the quiet. Clara reached the top step and rested her hand on the worn wood of the door. It was solid, heavier than she expected, and cool under her palm. She imagined the number of hands that had pushed it open before hers, the number of feet that had crossed the threshold into the space beyond. Eli came up beside her, tilting his head to look at the stained glass from below. "You can't even tell what the picture is," he said. "Not yet," she replied, digging into her bag for the keys. The largest one was a long iron shape with a loop big enough to fit her whole hand through. The lock resisted at first, the metal stiff from disuse, but after a slow turn, it yielded with a deep, echoing click. For a moment, they just stood there, mother and son, facing a building that seemed to watch them as much as they watched it. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wood rot and something older stone that had been wet for too long, air that hadn't moved freely in years. Eli's gaze swept over the weathered siding, the leaning spire, the grimy glass, and finally back to his mother. "It's big," he said, which was as close as he would get to a compliment for now. Clara gave a small smile, more to herself than to him. "Big is good," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure yet if it was. She wrapped her fingers tighter around the key, feeling the weight of it, and pushed the door open to let the dim interior swallow the winter light behind. The key felt colder than the air around it, its weight settling into her palm like something more than metal. Clara turned it slowly, letting the roughness of its rusted edges press against her skin. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of old iron that had been made to last a century or two, not the thin brass copies cut at the hardware store. In the weak afternoon light, the surface caught a dull gleam where her thumb had rubbed it clean. A small arc of bare metal breaking through the dark oxidation. She could imagine it hanging from a loop on the belt of some long-ago caretaker. A man who knew the sound of every hinge in the building and the way the bell rope felt after a rainy night. Now it was hers. Eli leaned against the carved doorframe, his hood half up, watching her study the key like it might start talking if she stared long enough. "You gonna open it, or just stand there?" His voice was half impatience, half curiosity, though he masked the latter with a smirk. Clara didn't answer right away. The key had been sitting in an envelope for less than a day, yet it already seemed to have changed its shape in her mind. At the auction, it had been a symbol of a gamble. Now, standing in front of the door, it fit. It was more like a unspoken agreement between herself and a structure that hadn't seen a steady human presence in more than 30 years. She shifted her grip and slipped it into the lock. The key slid in with a resistance that felt deliberate, like the tumblers inside weren't entirely sure they wanted to cooperate. A faint metallic scrape echoed in the space between door and frame. She turned it slowly, expecting the stiffness of decades to fight her all the way, but the mechanism yielded with an audible clunk, deep and final. The sound seemed to sink into the wood around it, vibrating faintly under her palm. For a moment, she didn't move. The air smelled faintly of cold stone and old wood, scents that came from somewhere beyond the door, reaching out like a hand through the smallest cracks. The wind picked up behind them, sliding past her shoulders into the seam between the doors, carrying the faintest breath of the church's interior. It was not just the smell of neglect, it was layered, holding the dust of hymnals left on shelves, the trace of candle wax that had seeped into the floorboards, the ghost of 1,000 footsteps worn into the aisles. She eased the key back out and felt the slight catch before it came free. It was an unfamiliar motion in her life, unlocking something this old. Every other door she'd turned a key in had been modern, quick to open, without ceremony. This one demanded patience, a kind of acknowledgement that you were entering on its terms. She found herself gripping the key tighter as she stepped back, as if some part of her expected the weight to pull her hand down. Eli stepped closer, his eyes flicking from the key to the door and back again. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" he said. She nodded, though she wasn't sure he meant the same thing she did. For him, maybe it was the weirdness of being about to walk into a space that had been sealed since before he was born. For her, it was the knowledge that she'd just agreed, in some intangible way, to be the person who broke that seal and lived with whatever came of it. She slipped the key into her coat pocket, feeling the heaviness against her thigh, even there. It seemed to tug slightly, as if it wanted to remind her of its presence. She thought about how many days, weeks, maybe months it would spend there coming out for inspections, repairs, explorations, until the shape of it became as familiar as the feel of her own house keys. But this one was different. This one didn't just open a door, it opened the sum of 30 years of silence. The wind shifted again, rattling the loose boards over one of the side windows, and Eli glanced toward the sound. "We should see what it looks like inside before it gets dark," he said. She nodded again, but didn't move right away. Instead, she drew the key out once more and turned it over in her hand, letting her fingers follow the grooves worn smooth by whoever had held. At last, there was something in that continuing line of people who had been caretakers of this space, whether they'd wanted the role or not. Finally, she closed her fist around it, felt the metals bite into her palm, and took a slow breath. The responsibility was already there, heavier than the iron itself. And as she reached for the door handle, she understood that opening it would mean more than just seeing the inside. It would mean stepping into whatever the building had been holding all these years and deciding piece by piece whether she could bear to hold it to. The door gave way with a reluctant groan, its weight pulling against her hand as if it had grown used to being left alone. Cold air spilled out first, a breath from another time, carrying with it the stale scent of damp wood and stone that had been shut in too long. Clara stepped over the threshold slowly, the iron key still warm in her palm from the turn of the lock. Eli followed, his sneakers making soft, hollow thuds on the warped floorboards just inside. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. It wasn't The kind of silence she knew from late nights at home after Eli had gone to bed, or the muffled stillness of snowfall. This was heavier, almost physical, as though the walls had absorbed decades of sound and were reluctant to give any of it back. Even their footsteps seemed to be swallowed before they could echo. Light cut into the dimness in narrow, slanted shafts from the fractured stained glass windows high on either wall. Dust motes hung suspended in those beams, drifting in the slow currents of air, their movement so slight it was hard to tell if they were falling or rising. The colors in the glass ruby reds, faded blues, amber yellows were dulled by grime, but still managed to tint the light enough to paint faint streaks of color onto the floor. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the front, their once polished surfaces dulled to a flat, uneven tone. Many sagged in the middle, their support beams bowed from years of weight and moisture. Here and there, hymnals lay abandoned on the seats, some with curled covers and pages gone brittle at the edges. She passed one with its spine split wide, the gold-stamped title barely legible. The air held the layered sense of rotting wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic, as though the building itself had a bloodstream that had gone stagnant. Eli wandered toward the center aisle, his hand brushing over the end of a pew, fingers trailing through the dust like a child drawing in beach sand. He tilted his head to look upward, toward the soaring wooden beams that arched across the ceiling. Some were cracked along their grain, and others had been patched haphazardly with metal brackets, though she doubted those repairs had been recent. The high ceilings seemed to pull the air upward, leaving the space around them cooler, almost damp. Near the front, the raised platform of the altar stood intact but bare. Whatever had once been the heart of the sanctuary, lecterns, altar cloths, candles, was gone, leaving only the outline of where they had been. Behind it, the wall was dominated by a tall, arched window, its panes clouded and fractured, the lead framing warped slightly from time. What little light filtered through was weak, bending around the cracks in strange patterns before it touched the worn boards of the platform. Clara walked slowly down the aisle, her boots creaking softly. The sound was swallowed almost as quickly as it came, but the faint echo that did linger had a hollow, uneven quality, bouncing in strange ways off the high walls. She imagined the sanctuary filled with voices, hymns, prayers, murmured conversations over years until they became part of the wood and stone. Now, all that remained was the memory of them, stretching thin and distant like the smell of a fire long since burned out. She reached the front pew and rested her hand on its back, feeling the smoothness worn into the wood where countless palms had rested before hers. Eli had stopped halfway down the aisle, staring at something in the far corner where a section of the floor had buckled, lifting one pew into a tilt that made it seem ready to slide sideways. "It's like the whole place is sinking," he said quietly, not looking away from the warped boards. "Not sinking," she said after a moment, "just waiting." She wasn't sure where the word had come from, but it felt true. The building had the stillness of something in between states, no longer what it had been. Not yet whatever it would become. Eli kicked gently at a piece of plaster that had fallen from the wall. Watching it break into smaller fragments on the floor, the sound, sharp and brief, seemed too loud for the space. He glanced at her as though to see if he'd disturbed something important. She shook her head and smiled faintly at the rear of the sanctuary. The door they'd come through stood ajar, letting in a strip of gray daylight that fell across the dust like a reminder of the world outside. But standing there in the muted light of the stained glass, surrounded by the smell of damp wood and the faint, uneven echoes that clung to the air, Clara felt as though they had stepped somewhere apart from time. She wasn't sure if the church would give up its silence easily, or at all. But she knew they'd just crossed into whatever story it had been holding on to. And now, whether they were ready or not, they were part of it. Eli stood in the middle of the aisle, his sneakers leaving faint prints in the film of dust coating the floorboards. His hood was still pulled halfway up, shadowing his face, but she could see the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders hunched, slightly like he was bracing for something. He looked at her, then at the rows of sagging pews, the peeling plaster high on the walls, the cracked glass in the tall windows. His voice came out flat, though not unkind. "Is this going to be another failed project?" The question landed between them with more weight than his tone suggested. It wasn't an accusation. Not exactly, but it wasn't idle curiosity either. He had seen enough starts without finishes in his 14 years to know what they looked like: the old dresser she'd hauled home to refinish, but ended up selling in pieces. The rented garden plot they'd abandoned after the second week of summer when the weeds got ahead of them. The kitchen chair she had meant to reupholster, still sitting with its foam exposed in the corner of their apartment. None of those things had mattered much on their own, but they formed a pattern, and Eli had always been quick to spot patterns. Clara kept her expression steady, though something inside her twisted at the familiarity of the question. She wanted to tell him this was different, but she knew he would hear it as the same kind of answer she'd given before. She stepped closer to one of the pews and brushed her fingertips along its back, letting the feel of the smooth, worn wood anchor her. "It's worth a try," she said, making her voice calm, almost casual. She didn't say it would work. She didn't promise it would turn out the way she hoped. Just that it was worth trying. Eli shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze drifting toward the altar as if searching for proof of her words in the shadows and dust. "It's huge," he said after a moment, the way someone might comment on a problem rather than a possibility. "And it's falling apart." "That just means it's been waiting," she said. She didn't know why she kept coming back to that thought, but it seemed to fit. Waiting could be good. Waiting meant there was still something here to be found, something no one else had bothered to see. He pushed his hands deeper into his jacket pockets and looked back at her. "What if we can't fix it?" It was quieter this time, not a challenge, but a question he really wanted an answer to. Clara drew in a slow breath and let it out through her nose. She wanted to tell him that failure wasn't the worst thing that could happen, that sometimes you did things just to see what was inside them, to see what might change in you along the way. But she could already picture his reaction to do. Arched eyebrow, maybe a sigh. So she said something simpler. "Then we'll know we tried." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. His gaze wandered back up toward the beams crossing the ceiling, following the lines of light from the cracked stained glass. She could tell he was taking it in despite himself, cataloging the shape of the place, the sounds it made when the wind pushed against the walls. She had learned over the years that Eli's reluctance didn't always mean refusal. Sometimes it meant he was holding back until he decided whether something was worth his effort. They stood there for a while in the cool stillness, neither speaking. Dust shifted lazily in the air between them. The quiet pressed in again, but it felt different. Now less like a barrier, more like an unasked question. Clara rested her hand on the back of the pew, feeling the subtle give of the old wood under her palm. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's see the rest of it." Eli glanced at her, then at the door they'd come through, as though weighing the comfort of leaving against the uncertainty of staying. After a beat, he stepped forward, following her down the aisle toward the side doors that led deeper into the church. His footsteps echoed faintly, the sound mingling with hers in the wide, empty space. She didn't know yet if he was coming, along because he believed her, or because he wanted to see for himself if she was wrong. Either way, he was moving, and for now, that was enough. The bell over the shop door gave a tired jingle as Clara stepped inside, brushing the cold from her coat. The air smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper, the kind of scent that belonged to places where merchandise had sat long enough to develop its own history. Shelves lined with canned goods and neatly folded linens crowded the narrow aisles, and a small counter stood near the back beneath a hand-painted sign that read Millford General. The man behind the counter looked up from his ledger, his reading, glasses balanced low on the bridge of his nose. He was older, maybe, late 60s, with hair the color of ash and a face that seemed permanently etched into lines of mild disapproval. Clara set a few items on the counter: bread, coffee, a jar of honey, and reached for her wallet. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her, the kind of look people gave when they were slotting you into a mental category. "You're the one who bought the old Methodist place," he said, the words not quite a question. Clara paused mid-motion, fingers resting on the worn leather of her wallet. "Yes, that's me." He made a soft, low sound in his throat, almost like a chuckle but without any humor. "That church should have stayed locked." The words hung between them, not loud, but with a weight that pressed down harder than the creak of the wooden floor beneath her boots. She waited for him to go on, but he didn't. He just scanned the bread and the coffee, sliding them into a paper bag with deliberate, unhurried movements. "Why is that?" she asked, careful to keep her voice even. His gaze flicked up, meeting hers for a moment. Whatever he saw there didn't seem to change his mind. "Just should've," he said, returning his attention to the register. The finality in his tone wasn't sharp, but it was firm, like the way a door closes when someone's decided a conversation is over. Eli, who had been hovering near the rack of postcards by the door, turned his head at the change in his mother's tone. "What does that mean?" he asked, curiosity edging into his voice. The shopkeeper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Means some things are better left alone," he said, ringing up the honey, especially in this town. Clara leaned a little closer to the counter, lowering her voice. "If there's something I should know about the building, I'd rather hear it than find out the hard way." He slid the last item into the bag and folded the top over, not looking at her as he spoke. "And if I tell you, you'll still go poking around down there, because that's what people do when they think warnings are just old stories." And then he trailed off, finally meeting her gaze again. Then it'll be too late to shut the door again. The register drawer closed with a dull snap. He named the total, and she handed over the cash, still waiting for him to fill the silence with something more specific. But he didn't. He just pushed the paper bag toward her, his hands lingering on the counter for a moment before he stepped back. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shop's front windows. Clara pushed the door open, the bell giving another jingle, and stepped into the chill. Eli followed, the bag cradled in his arms. They walked a few paces down the sidewalk before he spoke. "Do you think he meant something actually happened there?" he asked. "I think he meant he doesn't want to be the one to tell us," she said, glancing back toward the shop. Through the glass, she could see the shopkeeper watching them, his expression unreadable from this distance. The cold seemed sharper as they continued toward the church, the sky settling into a dull gray that pressed low over the rooftops. She told herself it was nothing small-town superstition, the kind of thing people clung to when a building had been empty long enough to gather rumors like dust. But his voice, quiet and certain, followed her as they walked. That church should have stayed locked by the time they reached the corner where the spire came into view again. She realized her fingers were clenched tighter around the paper bag than they needed to be. She made herself ease her grip, but the words stayed with her, threading through her thoughts like a draft she couldn't quite seal out. The kitchen of their small apartment smelled faintly of coffee and the faintly metallic temps of the radiator pushing out heat. Clara had been sorting through the box of odds and ends the auction clerk had given her, along with the deed and gazetums the county had found in a file cabinet during its brief inspection of the church. Most of it was paperwork that didn't matter anymore. Faded insurance forms, brittle envelopes with handwriting she couldn't decipher. A few receipts, so curled at the edges they wouldn't lie flat. She was about to push the box aside when a slip of yellowed newsprint caught her attention. It was folded into a tight rectangle, thin as a matchbook, wedged between two crumbling manila folders. The paper was brittle under her fingers, and she had to ease it open carefully, the crease, lines threatening to split. As it unfolded, the masthead of the Millford Chronicle appeared in smudged black ink. The date in the top corner, March 11th, 1984, the headline was short and strange in its restraint. Millford Methodist to close its doors. No subhead, no dramatic lead-in, just those words in neat type, followed by a short column of text. Clara leaned closer over the table, her coffee cooling beside her. The article was barely 8 sentences long. It stated that the church had officially ceased services. As of the previous Sunday, the building, according to the piece, was to be secured until further notice and would remain under the care of the Regional Board of Trustees. It mentioned a congregational disagreement that had led to the decision, though no details were offered. The Reverend's name was given, but nothing was said about where he had gone or why he had left. Halfway through, the tone shifted to a kind of forced optimism. The remaining parishioners were encouraged to attend services at neighboring congregations and maintain the unity of faith in the Millford community. It was the sort of polite official language that worked hard to smooth over the jagged edges of whatever had actually happened. There was no mention of the size of the split, who had left and who had stayed, or what could have driven a congregation some of whose families had been part of the church for generations to walk away from their own sanctuary. Eli wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on the night before. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the paper in her hands. A clipping, she said, from when the church closed. He leaned over her shoulder to read, his hair brushing against her cheek. Doesn't say much, he observed. After a moment, it's like they didn't want to talk about it. Clara nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the same lines again, as if some hidden meaning might reveal itself on a third pass. Sometimes not saying something says more than saying it. She murmured. He frowned, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. Do you think it's connected to what that guy in the store said about it staying locked? The memory of the shopkeeper's voice flickered in her mind, quiet, certain, unwilling to explain. She folded the clipping carefully, more gently than before, and slid it toward the center of the table. Maybe, she said, or maybe it's just one of those things small towns hold on to, a disagreement, a grudge. And after a while, it turns into something else. Eli tapped the edge of the paper with one finger. 39 years is a long time to keep a grudge. She couldn't argue with that, and yet the brevity of the article nagged at her. It was as though the real story had been edited away, leaving only a placeholder in the public record. No names of those who had left, no mention of why the split had been so final. Just a quiet announcement that the church was closed and locked, and life was to go on elsewhere. Clara folded the clipping again, this time along the original creases, and slipped it into the pocket of her notebook. We'll keep it, she said almost to herself. It might matter later. Eli raised an eyebrow. You think there's more to it? I think buildings remember things, she said, standing to rinse her coffee cup, even if the people don't want to talk about them. He gave a small shrug, but she saw the way his eyes flicked toward the notebook before he got up from the table. By the time he left the kitchen, the radiator had clicked off, and the air felt a little cooler. Clara reached into the box again, but her mind stayed on that thin strip of newsprint and the blank space between its lines. She had the uneasy sense that whatever had happened in 1984 wasn't done with the church or with her just yet. The narrow staircase to the bell tower began behind a half-height door at the rear of the sanctuary, almost hidden in the paneling. Clara had noticed it earlier, but the latch had been stiff, and she'd decided to leave it until they'd had a better look around. Now, with the daylight thinning and high windows, she pushed it open and found a spiral of wooden steps curling upward into darkness. The air inside was cooler, still carrying that faint metallic tang she'd caught near the front doors, only sharper here. Each step complained under her weight, the sound traveling ahead of them in a soft chain of creaks that faded into the unseen space above. Eli followed a few steps behind, his sneakers making quick, light scuffs as he tested each tread before putting his weight down. The walls were close, paneled in the same dark wood as the sanctuary, but here it felt older, less finished planks with visible knots, some warped enough to leave narrow gaps where slivers of light pushed through. Halfway up, the smell of rust grew stronger. Clara paused, one hand on the wall for balance, and looked up. Above, a rectangle of pale light marked where the stairs opened into the bell chamber. Dust swirled lazily in the beam, disturbed by their movements, and something, faint but steady, creaked overhead, like an old hinge shifting in the wind. When they reached the top, the space opened suddenly. The bell hung in the center, suspended from a massive wooden frame that was darkened with age. Its surface was mottled with rust, the once smooth bronze dulled to a reddish brown. But its shape was perfect, no cracks, no chips, only the marks of weather and time. The frayed rope dangled from the clapper, stretching down from the bell's heart through a pulley system bolted into the beams. It stopped just above the floorboards, the end unraveling into a tangle of fibers. Eli stepped closer, tilting his head back to take in the whole structure. It's huge, he said quietly. His voice seemed smaller here, swallowed by the wood and metal and the smell of years gone by. Clara ran her fingers lightly over the rope's rough strands. The fibers were stiff with age, and she could feel where they had thinned almost to breaking. I wonder when it last rang, she said. Eli glanced at the louvered openings in the tower walls. Through them, she could see narrow slices of the town-shingled rooftops, bare trees, the thin line of the road winding away. The light coming in was soft, edged with the gold of a late afternoon that was almost gone. He stepped to one of the openings and looked out, leaning carefully on the frame. You can see all the way to the mill from here, he said. If the glass was clean, you could probably see the river. She imagined the sound of the bell rolling over the rooftops, bouncing down the streets, calling people from every direction. In her mind, the rope was whole again, the bronze clean and shining, and the vibration of the strike could be felt through the floor. But here in the stillness, the bell seemed like a relic, something too proud to collapse entirely, but too tired to do what it was built for. Eli reached out and touched the side of the bell with the flat of his hand. The metal was cold, and a faint powder of rust came away on his skin. "Do you think it would still work?" he asked. Clara looked up at the heavy clapper. "Still and centered, maybe," she said, "but I don't think the rope would survive it." He nodded, wiping his palm on his jeans, and took another long look out through the slats. She watched him, wondering if he was imagining the same thing she was, the streets below full of people, the echo carrying for miles. A gust of wind slipped through the openings, whistling faintly as it moved around the bell. The frame creaked, and for a heartbeat, it almost sounded like the low start of a ring. Both of them stood still, listening, but the sound faded back into the quiet. Clara rested her hand briefly on one of the supporting beams before turning back toward the stairs. "Come on," she said, her voice softer now. "We should go down before it gets dark." Eli lingered for a moment longer, looking up at the bell again, then followed her, his footsteps light on the worn steps. The faint smell of rust and old rope trailed after them as they descended, and even after they'd stepped back into the sanctuary, Clara felt the weight of that silent bell above them, watching the town through slats of wood, waiting for a hand that might never pull its rope again. The light inside the sanctuary had shifted since they'd climbed down from the bell tower, turning the air more golden in the west-facing windows and deepening the shadows in the corners. Clara had been walking slowly along the side aisle, eyes tracing the details in the carved ends of the pews, when something near the floor caught her attention. She stopped mid-step, her boot hovering above the boards. The dust was thick here, a fine gray coat that dulled the grain of the wood and softened every edge. Her own prints and Eli's trailed behind her in a clear, pattern-large, side-by-side, impressions that disturbed the surface all the way back to the doors. But ahead of her, curving along the inside edge of the pews, was a second set of marks, smaller, narrower. The dust displaced in a way that suggested they'd been made recently, the edges crisp and not yet blurred by the slow settling that came. With time, she crouched to get a better look, bracing a hand on the smooth wood of the nearest pew. The prints were shaped like the soles of sneakers, but not adult-sized, maybe a child's or someone small-footed. She could see the faint grid of the tread in the dust, each square distinct. They didn't lead in a straight line, but curved toward the front of the church. Stopping abruptly near the third row, "Eli," she called quietly. He was on the other side of the sanctuary, testing how far his voice would echo when he spoke toward the altar. He turned at the sound of her tone, one eyebrow lifting. "What? Come here." When he reached her, she pointed toward the floor. "Those aren't ours." He followed her finger, his brow furrowing. "They're small," he said, dropping into a crouch beside her. He put his own sneaker next to one of the prints. It was almost an inch longer. "Not yours either," he added. "They're too sharp to be old," Clara said. "If they'd been here for years, the edges would have blurred, or they'd be filled in by dust falling from the ceiling." She straightened and glanced toward the doors, as if she might see someone slipping out. Eli looked back toward the pew where the prints ended. "Maybe they've sat down here." "Maybe," she said, but her mind was already considering other possibilities. Whoever had made them hadn't gone back the way they'd come, not in a way that left a trail. There were no matching prints heading in the opposite direction. She stepped into the row, her boots stirring small clouds of dust in the narrow aisle between the benches. The air smelled faintly of age and wood polish gone stale. At the spot where the prints ended, she paused. The bench here was no different from the others, same sag in the middle, same worn varnish on the armrest, but the space under it was unusually dark. She crouched again, leaning down to look. The dust beneath was disturbed, swept aside in irregular patterns, as though something or someone had crawled partway under. There was just enough room for a child to fit, maybe curled up on their side. The boards under there were scuffed bare in one patch. The wood lighter than the rest. Eli knelt beside her, peering into the shadows. "That's creepy," he said under his breath. She didn't disagree. Straightening, she looked around the sanctuary again. Every sound felt sharper, now the faint crack of the wood as it cooled, the occasional soft tick from the old heating pipes hidden behind the walls. The light from the high windows had shifted again, casting the pews in long stripes of shadow. "Could be kids from town," Eli said after a moment, his voice quieter now, messing around. "Maybe they dared each other to come inside. Maybe," she said again. But the padlock on the front door had been solid, and she was the one who had turned that key for the first time in decades, unless they'd come in from somewhere else. She thought about the back of the building, the narrow hallway they hadn't explored yet, the half-rotted side door with its warped frame. The church was old, and old buildings had ways of letting people in if they knew where to look. Clara let her eyes drift back to the small footprints. Whoever had left them had been here recent enough that she felt a prickle between her shoulder blades now, as though they could still be close. She pushed the thought aside, but it stayed with her as she moved toward the far end of the aisle, her steps slower, more deliberate. The church, silent as it was, no longer felt entirely empty. The far end of the sanctuary narrowed into a dim pocket of shadow beneath the choir loft. The loft itself jutted out over the space like the balcony of an old theater, its rail lined with dust-thick balusters and a row of warped hymn book shelves. Clara had been moving slowly in that direction without much thought, following the side aisle past the last pew, when the change in the air made her stop. It was cooler here, the temperature dropping just enough to raise the hairs on her arms. The floorboards underfoot gave a lower, hollower sound with each step, as though something deeper than a crawl space lay below. Set into the wall directly beneath the loft was a door. The wood was darker than the surrounding paneling, its surface marked with long vertical scars, maybe from furniture or equipment that had been dragged past it years ago. Iron straps crossed it in two places, bolted deep into the frame, and at eye level hung a padlock. The lock caught her attention immediately because it didn't belong. The rest of the church wore its age in peeling paint, tarnished metal, and wood turned brittle with time, but the padlock looked almost new. It was the kind you might find on a modern storage unit still bodied, with a smooth shackle that reflected what little light reached it. The contrast was jarring, as if the church had been left to decay, except for this one barrier, which someone had made sure to reinforce. Eli came up behind her, his voice low. "That doesn't look like it's been here since the 80s. Shook her head slowly, taking a step closer. The padlock was free of rust, the keyway clean. It hadn't been here long enough to collect more than a light dusting of the same fine gray powder that covered everything else. She reached out and touched the wood near it, feeling the subtle difference in temperature where the door met the frame. Cold air whispered faintly through the seam at the bottom. Eli crouched and peered into the narrow gap between the planks. "Can't see much," he said, leaning back on his heels. "Smells like, I don't know, metal and something damp." Clara stayed quiet, her mind turning over the details. Someone had been in here in recent years, long enough after the church had been locked up to fit it with a new padlock, short enough that it still looked like it could have been bought last month. That meant there was something behind this door, worth securing, something more than an old boiler or a pile of hymnals. She stepped back to take in the full frame. The door was slightly recessed into the wall, framed by stone blocks rather than the wooden paneling that covered most of the sanctuary. That alone suggested the space beyond had been part of the church's original structure, not an afterthought. The hinges, though rusted, were enormous, designed to bear real weight. Eli stood, dusting his hands on his jeans. "Do you think it's where those footprints came from?" he asked. "It's possible," she said. She thought again of the small tracks in the side aisle, ending abruptly near a pew. If someone knew another way into the basement, they could have bypassed the front doors entirely. The padlock felt like a challenge, the kind that pressed against her curiosity until it became almost physical. She curled her fingers into her palm to resist the urge to test it, to see if it might give with the right twist or pull. Breaking it would mean crossing a line she wasn't ready for not yet. But she also knew that whatever was behind this door was part of the reason the church had stayed locked for nearly 40 years, and possibly part of why certain townspeople wanted it to stay that way. Eli stepped back into the center of the aisle, glancing up toward the loft above them. "Feels weird down here," he murmured. Clara didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the padlock, the faint reflection of light on its surface, the solid presence of the oak door behind it. The rest of the sanctuary seemed to fade, the quiet pressing in until it was just her, the lock, and the question of what someone had gone out of their way to keep from view. The vestry was smaller than Clara expected, tucked behind a narrow door off the sanctuary's east side. It smelled faintly of mothballs, and something older perhaps, candle wax, gone stale with age. A single window, cloudy with years of grime, let in a muted light that fell across the center of the room. A desk sat, pushed against the far wall, its dark finish dulled and its surface scattered with curled scraps of paper, an empty inkwell, and a ceramic dish holding two mismatched buttons. She began to open the drawers one at a time. Not really sure what she was looking for, perhaps a spare set of building keys, perhaps nothing more than a sign that someone had once worked in here daily. The top left drawer was full of brittle hymn sheets and a small cloth bag containing what felt like pebbles. The right side held stacks of folded bulletins, the dates fading from recent memory, January 1984. March 1984. When she slid open the bottom drawer, something small shifted inside and struck the wooden side with a faint metallic tap. She pushed a sheaf of discolored stationery aside and saw Ida key, lying alone in the dust that had settled inside the drawer. It was no larger than her thumb, made of brass that had darkened with tarnish, though the edges still caught the light. The bow was circular, simple, worn smooth from what must have been years of handling. She picked it up, feeling its unexpected weight. It wasn't a modern house key, nor the long, ornate sort that fit the church's front doors. This was different, shorter, stouter, the kind of key made for something built to keep people out. Eli appeared in the doorway, leaning his shoulder against the frame. Find something. She held the key up between her thumb and forefinger. Maybe he stepped in, eyes narrowing slightly. Looks old, but not useless, she said, turning it in her hand. A thought formed almost immediately, unwelcome but insistent. The padlock on the basement door. They crossed the sanctuary without speaking, their footsteps sounding louder in the stillness. The shadows had lengthened since they'd last been here, spilling down from the choir loft and pooling at the far end. The oak door loomed ahead, its iron straps dark against the wood. The padlock waiting in its place, Clara paused before it, glancing at Eli. "It probably won't work," she said, though her pulse had quickened in a way that betrayed her doubt. She slid the key into the lock's narrow keyway. It resisted for a fraction of a second, as if testing her, then turned with a smoothness that felt impossible for something so tarnished. The shackle released with a dull metallic pop, swinging open in her hand. Eli let out a low whistle. "That's not supposed to happen." Clara pulled the padlock free and held it for a moment, feeling the solid weight of it. There was no way a key she'd found in a dusty desk drawer, likely untouched for decades, should have fit a lock that looked nearly new. It was as if the padlock had been chosen with the key already in mind. Waiting for someone to find it, she set the padlock gently on the floor and placed her hand on the door's rough surface. The wood was cold, even colder now than it had been earlier, and the faint breath of air escaping through the seam at the bottom seemed sharper, carrying with it a smell she couldn't place, something mineral, damp, and faintly metallic. Eli shifted his weight, glancing toward the sanctuary as though expecting movement there. "Do we open it?" he asked. Clara didn't answer right away. The key was still warm in her palm from the turn in the lock, its edges pressing lightly into her skin. The simplicity of the act sliding it in, feeling the mechanism yield, had left her with more unease than relief. Whatever lay beyond the oak door had been locked away deliberately, and now, without even forcing it, she had undone that choice. She curled her fingers around the key and stepped back, the unlocked door standing between them and whatever waited in the darkness below. The hinges groaned as Clara eased the heavy oak door inward. The sound was deep, resonant, as if the metal parts had been unmoved for far longer than they should have been. A thin line of darkness widened slowly, and with it came a breath of air that made the hair on her arms stand up. It slid past her like water poured over ice, sinking into her clothes, creeping along the back of her neck. The draft carried with it a smell that was more than just the dampness of a closed basement. It had weight, a tang that clung to the inside of her nose, metallic, sharp, like a handful of coins left in the palm too long. Beneath that was another note, harder to place. "The dry? It's freezing," he murmured. His voice seemed to disappear into the darkness beyond the threshold. Clara reached for the wall inside the doorway. her fingertips brushing over rough stone before finding a wooden railing. She could just make out the top of a staircase descending into shadow. The steps were steep and narrow, built of thick planks worn smooth in the middle. A faint sheen of moisture glistened along the edges where the light from the sanctuary touched. She took one step inside, the change in temperature immediate. Her breath formed pale threads in the air before fading away. Eli hesitated at the threshold, shifting from foot to foot as if deciding whether to follow. The smell was stronger here. The metallic tenth seemed to coat her tongue now, mingling with a faint mineral dampness, like water that had sat too long in iron pipes. She thought of the river a mile away, its banks lined with rusting machinery from the old mill. There was something of that same forgotten heaviness in the air. Here she tested the first step with her weight. It groaned, but held. The sound traveled downward, echoing faintly against unseen walls. Somewhere below, water dripped slow, measured, each drop striking with a hollow note that made the space feel deeper than it looked. Eli stepped in behind her, his sneakers squeaking softly against the wood. "Do you think it's safe?" "Safe? Enough," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure. The draft continued to rise, constant and steady, as if the basement breathed. She tried to picture what lay at the bottom. Storage rooms, perhaps a furnace long since gone cold, stacks of broken furniture under tarps. But the air didn't match those images. This wasn't the stale, flat atmosphere of an abandoned storage space. It moved as if something far below was drawing it upward, the way air shifted near the mouth of a tunnel. They descended to more steps, and the light from the sanctuary dimmed behind them. The shadows thickened, swallowing detail until only the railing and the outline of each tread remained. Clara's free hand brushed the wall against stone, damp to the touch now, its surface uneven and cold as though it had never known warmth. The metallic scent grew sharper with every step. No longer entirely masked by the damp, she thought of old tools, of blood, of metal, left out in the rain until it took on that reddish smell of oxidation. She glanced back at Eli, but his expression was unreadable in the dim light dot. At the fifth step, she stopped. The sound of their movement had stirred something else, a faint, low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was barely there, more felt than heard, but it threaded through the cold air like a current. She drew in a breath, trying to separate the sound from the silence around it, but it faded as quickly as it had come. The door above them remained open, its frame casting a pale rectangle of light onto the stairs. Clara looked at it once before, turning back to the darkness below. The air still rose steadily, curling past them, and she had the uneasy sense that it was not merely the product of cold stone and underground space. It felt deliberate, as though the place itself had been exhaling for years, waiting for the door to open so it could breathe again. The wooden steps gave way to stone, sooner than Clara expected. The change underfoot was abrupt, a shift from the hollow creak of planks to the solid, unyielding weight of something far older. The stone was cold, each tread slick in the center, from years of use and a thin sheen of moisture that caught the light from above. The air pressed closer here, the metallic temps sharper now, mingled with the wet mineral smell of earth deep underground. She ran her hand along the wall as they descended. The surface was uneven, not the flat masonry of modern construction, but rough bedrock carved directly into shape. Tool marks were faint but present, shallow grooves running in uneven lines, as though whoever had shaped the staircase had worked quickly, with more concern for depth than precision. In places, the rock glittered faintly where droplets had formed, catching and reflecting the narrow shaft of light from the open door far above. Eli's steps echoed differently now. The sound traveled down the passage instead of up, vanishing into the darkness below. He trailed one hand along the opposite wall, his fingers brushing through the damp. "This feels older than the church," he said quietly, as though speaking too loudly might wake something in the stone. Clara thought the same. The church above had the symmetry and care of a 19th century building, its beams and panels crafted by trained hands. But here, beneath it, the work was rougher, more primal. Whoever had carved these steps had done so for function alone, beauty. The staircase turned once, then again, the angles sharp enough that the light from above barely reached them now. The cold intensified with each bend, rising from the depths like something alive. Clara's breath hung in the air before her, and Eli's did the same, two pale streams drifting upward to be swallowed by the dark. Her boots scuffed against the stone, and she noticed a faint crunch beneath one step grit and tiny fragments that had broken loose from the walls. The glistening moisture was more pronounced here, collecting in thin rivulets that traced uneven paths downward, disappearing into hairline cracks between the steps. In some places, the walls wept steadily, the droplets falling with soft, irregular plinks onto the treads. She glanced up briefly. The rectangle of light at the top had shrunk. The open door now just a pale reminder that they weren't completely cut off from the surface. It felt farther away than it should have, as though each step down carried them more than a step's worth of distance. Eli slowed, his gaze fixed downward. "How far does this go?" "I don't know," Clara said, and it was the truth. She'd expected perhaps a dozen steps before reaching a basement floor, maybe a simple stone room used for storage. But the staircase kept pulling them deeper, the air denser, the smell of metal and damp rock growing stronger. The sound of dripping water became more constant, echoing faintly, as though there were open space below. She could hear it ahead of them now, distinct from the drops falling directly around them. The acoustics hinted at a chamber something larger than the narrow stairwell they occupied. A faint vibration ran through the wall under her fingertips. She paused, pressing her palm flat against the damp stone, but it was gone almost as soon as she noticed it. The rock felt solid, ancient, yet not entirely still. They reached another turn, and Clara hesitated before stepping around it. The darkness beyond seemed heavier here, almost tactile, as if it might cling to them when they entered. She could see no end to the descent, only more steps cut from the bedrock, each one worn and darkened by age. Somewhere far below, a draft shifted, carrying with it a colder wave of that metallic scent, strong enough to make her inhale sharply. Eli caught her glance and tightened his grip on the railing carved into the wall. Neither of them spoke again as they kept moving downward, the stone swallowing their footsteps, the light from above fading until it felt like they had left the church far behind and entered something much older, much deeper than they had intended. The final step came almost without warning, the narrow descent flattening into a stretch of level stone. Clara paused, letting her eyes adjust to the deeper dark. The air here was still colder, almost heavy, settling against her skin in a way that felt more like immersion than simple chill. The faint metallic scent she'd noticed earlier was joined now by something else, an undercurrent of stale air, the kind that comes from a place sealed for decades. She took a careful step forward, her boots making a muted scrape against the damp stone floor. The space ahead wasn't the open basement she'd pictured in her mind. Instead, the staircase had delivered them into a narrow corridor, the ceiling arched and low enough that she could touch it if she raised her hand. The walls were rough stone, but the curve of the ceiling was deliberate, almost architectural, as though whoever had built this had meant for it to last. Set into each side of the corridor were arched doorways, their openings dark and silent. The shapes were uniform narrow at the base, widening slightly into a rounded peak. Some had doors still fitted into their frames, heavy slabs of wood reinforced with iron bands, their surfaces swollen and pitted with age. Others stood open, yawning into shadow, the thresholds marked by a faint change in the stone where countless feet must have passed long ago. Eli came up beside her, his voice low. "It's like a hallway in a crypt." She glanced at him, not disagreeing. The comparison fit. The air was too cold, the silence too complete for it to feel like any kind of storage cellar. Even the way the sound of their breathing echoed back seemed contained, pressed into the close space. They moved cautiously along the corridor, passing the first doorway on the right. Clara paused at its edge, peering in. The room beyond was small, maybe 10 feet square. Its ceiling vaulted like the hallways. The floor was bare stone, and in the far corner lay a broken wooden chair, its legs warped and splintered. No windows, no sign of recent use, just the stale scent of enclosed air. Across the corridor, another room mirrored its same size, same empty feel. But the third doorway they came to was different. It stood open, the archway wider, the floor inside uneven. Clara stepped into it, finding the walls lined with narrow niches, each about the length of her arm. The sight made her pause. The niches were empty now, but their shape was unmistakable spaces cut for storage. Or perhaps for something less mundane. Eli hung back in the hall, his eyes darting between the shadows ahead and the lightless rooms. They passed. Why would a church need all these? Clara didn't answer immediately. Her fingers brushed the edge of one niche. The stone here was smoother than the rougher cuts in the staircase, worn down over time. She stepped back into the hall, scanning the rest of the corridor. It stretched farther than she could see in the dimness. More doorways branching off like ribs from a spine. The cold draft she'd felt earlier still whispered along the floor, carrying with it the faint sound of water from somewhere deeper in the structure. The air didn't feel stagnant. Not entirely. It moved, as though these rooms connected to something larger. One of the closed doors they passed bore a strange mark scratched into the wood, deep and deliberate. It looked recent compared to the rest of the structure, the grooves clean, the edges not yet softened by time. Clara reached out to trace it, feeling the roughness under her fingertips. It wasn't a letter she recognized, nor a number. It was more like a symbol, something simple but deliberate, cut with the point of a blade. They kept moving, the corridor drawing them farther from the stairway. The space felt layered, as if each doorway might reveal a different piece of the building's history, none of it entirely explained by the church above. Clara's eyes kept sliding back to the shadows pooling inside the open rooms, the cold air brushing past her as if something down here was shifting, adjusting to their presence. Somewhere ahead, the passage bent out of sight. The thought that there was more beyond this, more rooms, more doors, pulled at her curiosity, even as the silence pressed harder against her ears. The deeper they went, the more the space felt like it had been built for something other than worship, something that had been meant to stay hidden. The doorway to the room was narrower than the others, framed by stone blocks darker than the surrounding walls. The air inside was heavier, less cold, and carried a faint smell of old paper and ink that shouldn't have survived so far underground. Clara stepped inside slowly, her boots sinking slightly into a layer of fine dust that softened the sound of her movements. The room was small, no more than 12 feet across, but it felt crowded. Against the walls stood a row of metal filing cabinets, their once-gray paint mottled with patches of rust. A wooden desk leaned in one corner, its top warped from moisture, a single drawer hanging half open. The rest of the space was taken up by stacks of boxes, some collapsed under their own weight. Spilling brittle papers across the floor, Eli hovered in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame. Looks like an office. Clara moved to the nearest cabinet. The drawers resisted at first, their handles stiff with age, but after a firm pull, one slid open with a reluctant screech. Inside were neat bundles of paper tied with fraying string. She lifted one, brushing away a layer of dust, and saw the date written across the top in careful script, April 1862. The ink had faded to a brownish gray, but the handwriting was still legible. Names, dates, events, each entry written in the same hand, the lines straight and measured as if the person had been copying them into the book for permanence. She realized with a start that she was holding a baptism ledger, each name followed by a date and the name of the officiating pastor. Some included notes in the margins. Father lost at sea, family relocated to Albany, infant did not survive winter. She replaced the bundle and pulled out another drawer. This one contained ledgers bound in cracked leather, their spines curling from years of damp. The pages inside were filled with more of the same baptisms, marriages, funerals, spanning decades, but alongside the formal entries were pages of looser notes scrawled in a different hand. The pen strokes uneven and hurried. Clara read a fragment aloud without thinking. Dispute among elders unresolved, meeting postponed. Recommended locking cellar until further notice. The date beside it was 1887. She glanced at Eli, but he was already looking at the desk in the corner. He crossed the room, stepping carefully over a fallen stack of folders, and tugged at the drawer. It came free easily, revealing a jumble of loose sheets. He lifted one and frowned. "This one's not church records," he said, handing it to her. The paper was thin, lined, the handwriting more angular than the careful script of the ledgers. It was a letter, though it lacked a greeting. The first line read, "If these papers are found, the truth should not be forgotten." The rest was harder to make out. Parts of the ink had bled, where water had touched it, but phrases stood out, kept below. Not for public eyes, keys hidden in plain sight. Clara set it down and opened the next cabinet. More? Ledgers, some going back further than she expected. The earliest she could find dated 1829. Those entries were more fragmented, some written in a foreign language she didn't recognize. The lettering sharp and precise. She traced one of the lines with her finger, wondering who had kept these records and why they'd been stored here instead of in the church above. In the far corner of the room, one box had collapsed entirely, its contents fanned across the stone floor. Clara crouched beside it, lifting a handful of pages. These were more personal scraps of sermons, letters between clergy, and in one case, a sketch of the church's floor plan. The drawing was detailed, showing not only the sanctuary and choir loft, but also the basement corridor they had just walked through. Several of the rooms were marked with symbols rather than labels, and the staircase they had descended was shaded. Heavily, as if to draw attention, Eli was quiet now, scanning the open ledgers on the desk. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere down the corridor outside, but here, surrounded by paper and ink from centuries past, it felt distant. Clara slid one of the ledgers closed, the soft thud of it landing on the stack breaking. The stillness. There was too much to read, too many layers of history pressed into this single room. And somewhere in the mix buried between baptisms and marriages were pieces of something the church had deliberately locked away. Whatever it was, it had been documented, filed, and left in the dark. And now, for the first time in generations, someone was turning those pages again. The corridor narrowed as they moved farther from the stairwell, the arched ceiling pressing closer overhead. The cold here was sharper, no longer the steady damp chill of stone, but something more biting, as though the air itself was unwilling to be disturbed. Their footsteps echoed differently, to less hollow. More contained than the sound broke entirely when they rounded the final bend and saw it. The door stood at the end of the hall, set into the wall as if the entire passage had been built to lead directly to it. Unlike the arched wooden frames they had passed before, this one was solid iron, its surface dark with age, yet without the rot or warping that had claimed other doors. The metal was thick, riveted into heavy plates, the seams barely visible except where the dim light caught on the edges. A locking mechanism dominated the center, broad iron plate with a keyhole unlike any Clara had ever seen. It wasn't the narrow slit of a standard key, but a rounded opening with intricate notches cut into its perimeter. The pattern oddly asymmetrical. Around it, a ring of worn symbols had been etched into the iron itself, their edges softened but still readable to the touch. Eli stopped a few steps back, his eyes moving from the keyhole to the corners of the doorframe, her hand along the edge where the iron met the stone. The frame was flush, the masonry fitted so tightly there was no gap at all. She tapped it with her knuckles, and the sound it gave back was dense, muffled, as if whatever lay behind the door was encased in more than just empty space. The locking plate itself seemed out of time, older than the church, older even than the carved staircase. It reminded her of photographs she'd once seen of fortified vaults, the kind used to guard treasures or dangerous things. The craftsmanship was careful, purposeful, as though the maker had intended for the door to resist not only intrusion, but the passage of centuries. She bent slightly, studying the strange symbols around the lock. They weren't letters from any alphabet she knew. Some looked almost like runes, their lines intersecting at odd angles. Others were curved, looping into shapes that might have been decorative or might have carried a meaning long forgotten. The shallow grooves were darkened with something, maybe rust, maybe just the shadow of age. Her fingertips found a dent just above the keyhole, the metal there smoother than the rest. It felt like the place where a hand might naturally rest while turning a key, but the thought of a key fitting into that irregular opening seemed almost absurd. Yes, she said quietly, and meant it. The presence of the door alone suggested it had guarded something that required this kind of security, that it was here, beneath a church. Only made the question of why more pressing. She tried the handle, or what passed for one, a heavy iron bar bolted just beneath the lock. It didn't move at all, not even a rattle. The mechanism was as unmoving as if it had been welded shut for a moment. She imagined what it would take to open it without the key: tools, time, and a great deal of noise. Even then, the thickness of the metal suggested that brute force might not be enough. Whoever had installed it had intended permanence. The corridor behind them seemed to quiet further, the faint sounds of water and distant drafts dimming until all she could hear was the steady sound of her own breathing. The air near the door was colder still, and that metallic tank she had smelled earlier was strongest here, as if the iron itself was radiating it. Clara stepped back, her eyes tracing the seams of the door one more time. It felt less like an entrance, and more like a warning, a boundary drawn between the world they knew and something they were not meant to disturb. Yet the knowledge that it was locked only made her want to see what lay behind it more. Eli's voice broke the silence. She didn't answer, but the thought stayed with her. Somewhere among the ledgers, the empty rooms, and the strange symbols, there might be a way to turn that ancient lock. And whatever it guarded had been waiting in the dark for far longer than either of them had been alive. The wall to the right of the iron door was not like the rest of the corridor. The stone here was lighter in color, smoother, as if it had been deliberately shaped rather than left in the rough state of the other walls. Clara noticed it first, in the way the light from her small flashlight reflected differently, catching on shallow ridges and curves. When she stepped closer, she saw the carvings dot at first glance. They looked like a series of crosses, their arms equal in length, each one enclosed within a circle. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw that none of the crosses were quite the same. Some were plain, their lines clean and straight. Others were embellished, the ends flaring outward or capped with tiny diamond shapes. The circles around them were not perfect, each interrupted by sharp angles or small triangular cutouts. Between the crosses were other shapes lines, intersecting at odd angles, arcs meeting in precise but unfamiliar ways. Some looked almost like architectural diagrams, others like constellations sketched from memory. The patterns wove together, crossing over and under each other so that it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Eli stepped up beside her, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. "These aren't just decorations," he said, tracing a finger a few inches above the stone without touching it. "They look like, I don't know, instructions." Clara crouched to examine a section near the base of the wall. Here, one of the crosses had been carved deeper than the others, the grooves still sharp despite the centuries. Around it, the geometric lines formed a pattern that almost looked like a key-long vertical lines intersected by smaller angled ones. As though mapping out dimensions, she felt the urge to press her palm into the carving, to see if the shapes fit her hand, but stopped herself. The more she looked, the more deliberate it all seemed. The spacing between each carving was exact, the alignment precise. Whoever had made these had worked with intent, measuring and marking each detail with care. And yet, the meaning remained just out of reach. The combination of Christian iconography with the abstract geometric designs made it hard to place in a single tradition. It was as if to systems one familiar, one entirely alien had been merged. In the upper right corner of the panel, a series of smaller carvings caught her eye. They were arranged in a row, a cross within a circle, then a triangle bisected by a vertical line, then a six-pointed star. Between each was a small hollow, no larger than the tip of her finger. She leaned closer and saw that the hollows were worn smooth, the stone polished by repeated contact. People had touched these, perhaps pressed their fingers into them. Over and over again, Eli pointed toward the base of the wall. "There's something here too." She followed his gaze and saw another set of marks, this time not carved but scratched into the stone. These were cruder, the lines uneven. The symbols here were different zigzags, spirals, and what looked like tally marks grouped in fives. The depth of the scratches suggested a metal tool had been used. Some of them overlapped the older carvings, as if whoever made them hadn't cared about disturbing the original designs. A faint shiver ran down Clara's back, though the air was already cold enough to make her skin prickle. She stood and stepped back, taking in the whole wall. The carvings seemed to radiate outward from the point closest to the iron door, the designs growing more complex the nearer they came to it. It was almost as if the symbols were meant to guard the door or perhaps to open it. The silence of the corridor seemed heavier here. Even the soft drip of water they had heard elsewhere was absent, replaced by a stillness that made their breathing sound loud. Clara felt an odd pull, the same sensation she'd had when standing before the locked door, a mixture of curiosity and caution. Eli's voice was quieter now. "Do you think this is a code for the lock?" She didn't know, but the thought lodged itself in her mind. If the carvings were a key, they were one she didn't yet know how to read. And if they were a warning, it wasn't clear whether they were meant for people like her, for whatever might be waiting on the other side of the iron door. The rest of that day, Clara noticed a change in Eli. He wasn't just curious about the carvings, they had taken root in him. Even after they had left the basement and climbed back into the weak daylight of the sanctuary, she caught him glancing back toward the choir loft, as if the iron door and its wall of symbols were still visible through the floorboards. By the time they got home, he was already pulling out his laptop. The screen's pale glow, typing in phrases like cross in a circle, geometric carvings in churches, and symbols carved in stone walls. Most of what came up were harmless architectural motifs, stained glass designs, Celtic crosses, but every so often, an image would make him sit up straighter, the cursor hovering over a link. Clara, washing dishes nearby, caught glimpses of old sketches and photographs in sepia tones. Men in suits standing beneath banners embroidered with strange shapes, emblems stamped into the covers of worn leather books. By the second hour, he shifted from casual browsing to combing through online archives. Historical Society websites scanned pages from out-of-print reference books, discussion boards where people posted blurry photographs of markings they'd found in attics or old lodges. Patterns began to emerge. Some of the crosses matched insignias from fraternal orders that had been active in the 1800s. Others mirrored diagrams linked to groups she'd never heard of, their names an odd blend of biblical language and arcane titles: the Brotherhood of the Compass, the Order of the Sacred Geometry, the Pillars of Light. What struck him most were the similarities in placement. In old meeting halls or hidden rooms, these symbols often appeared clustered near entrances, sometimes even framing locked cabinets or concealed doors. One article he found, dated 1912, described a Masonic offshoot in New England, whose initiation rituals involved passing through the gateway of the marked wall before being granted access to the inner chamber. The description made his pulse quicken. It sounded too much like the carved wall in the church. Clara dried her hands and leaned over his shoulder. "You think they were meeting down there?" she asked. "Not just meeting," he said, scrolling quickly. "I think this was one of their main sites, maybe even before it was a church." She frowned. "But the church records only go back to the mid-1800s, he finished for her. "That doesn't mean the building, or at least the foundation, wasn't here before that. If a group was already using it, the church might have just taken it over." The theory was bold, but the evidence on his screen kept mounting. He found photographs of medals awarded to members of a 19th century fraternal society in Vermont, small discs of brass engraved with crosses inside circles, nearly identical to the deeper carvings on the basement wall. Another image, from a private collector's site, showed a Keatit's bow shaped like one of the triangular symbols they'd seen etched above the hollows in the wall. Hours passed without Eli noticing. He opened tabs faster than he could read them, his notes scrawled across a pad beside him in cramped handwriting. Some were just quick references: compare to carving number 3, or check distance between hollows, symbols equals stages, lock mechanism tied to order. By the time the clock read nearly midnight, Clara had to remind him to eat. He barely looked up from the screen, muttering something about how the carvings weren't random, how they told a sequence. He was certain that if he could map them in the right order, he might figure out what the iron door was hiding. Later, when she finally got him to shut the laptop and go to bed, she noticed he had left one page open, a scan of an 1894 booklet titled Rites of the Third Chamber. The section he had highlighted read, "Only through the marks of the faithful may the sealed passage be opened. The key is not a key, but a knowledge carried in the minds of those who walk the pattern." The words stayed with her long after. The lights were out because she knew Eli wouldn't let them go. Whatever the carvings meant, they had already become more than a mystery to him. They were a puzzle he was determined to solve, no matter how deep into the past he had to dig to find the answer. It was a cold Thursday morning when Clara first heard from Lydia Crane. The call came unexpectedly. The voice on the other end, precise and formal, introducing herself as a professor of history at the nearby university. She explained that she specialized in New England's architectural and cultural history, particularly structures tied to religious and fraternal orders of the 18th and 19th centuries. Clara had no idea how the woman had even learned about the purchase. She had told almost no one beyond a few shopkeepers in town, but Lydia said word of such properties tended to travel quickly in certain circles. She asked if she might visit, offering to drive out that same afternoon. When the old sedan pulled up in front of the church, Clara immediately recognized Lydia from her university website photo, tall, with sharp features and a way of standing that suggested she was more used to lecturing a hall of students than walking into damp basements. A long wool coat hung from her frame, buttoned to the neck, and her dark hair was pinned into a tidy twist. She shook Clara's hand firmly, her eyes moving almost immediately to the towering spire behind them. "It's remarkable it's still standing," Lydia murmured, stepping back to take in the weathered facade. She walked slowly along the perimeter, pausing to study the boarded windows and the arched stonework around the door. Her gaze lingered on the bell tower before she nodded toward the entrance. "May I inside?" She moved with a deliberate pace, absorbing the details without the small talk most visitors offered. Her eyes traced the sagging pews, the cracked plaster, the faint outlines where religious banners might once have hung. Clara led her toward the far end of the sanctuary and down into the basement, the professor's steps slowing noticeably as the air cooled and the stone corridor opened before them. When they reached the iron door, Lydia stopped abruptly. For a moment, she said nothing at all, her eyes fixed on the carvings along the wall. Then she took a single step forward, almost reverently, and brushed her fingertips over one of the deeper cuts in the stone. "I haven't seen this exact configuration in more than 20 years, she said quietly, "and never in a church." Her expression was difficult to read, part fascination, part unease. She began tracing the sequence of symbols, following the line of crosses and geometric shapes with an almost mechanical precision. Every so often, she would pause, tilt her head, and then continue. "These are not random," she said finally. Glancing at Clara, they're an encoded form of what's called a Templar cipher, symbolic language used by certain fraternal orders in the 19th century, some of which claimed a lineage going back to the Crusades. "This variation is unusual." She hesitated, her voice lowering. "It suggests an order that wanted to blend in with the appearance of Christian worship, while maintaining a private system of knowledge for its members." Clara exchanged a look with Eli, who had edged closer, listening intently. "What would they need to hide behind a door like this?" she asked. Lydia's eyes returned to the lock. "The fact that it's iron and still in place tells me they expected to keep it closed for a very long time. These groups often stored more than just ritual objects. Sometimes it was valuable property, sometimes documents, and sometimes things they didn't want the public to see." She stepped back and took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping the wall once more. "These carvings form more than decoration. If I'm correct, they also represent a sequence of movement, expressing or touching specific points in a particular order. It was a form of lock in itself, before you even got to the key." Her tone shifted then, softening but losing none of its gravity. "I would be very careful, Mrs. Mason. Places like this have layers of history, and not all of them are benign. Whoever left these marks intended them for the initiated alone. To stumble into that knowledge without the right preparation could be dangerous." Clara felt the weight of the words more than their exact meaning, but she could tell from Eli's expression that he was already committed to the opposite of caution. Lydia seemed to notice too. Her eyes lingered on him for a beat longer than necessary before she turned toward the stairs. "I'll send you some reference materials," she said at last. "And if you're willing, I'd like to return with some equipment for a more detailed study. But for now, leave the door as it is. Whatever's behind it has waited this long. It can wait a little longer." Clara nodded, but as she watched the professor's car disappear down the road, she knew the stillness behind that iron door had just grown heavier. Someone else now carried its image in their mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the church had just stepped a little closer to revealing itself. Professor Lydia Crane sat across from Clara at the small kitchen table, the morning light filtering weakly through the curtains and casting a pale glow over the cluttered space. Between them lay several thick books and printed pages, worn maps, and diagrams, all spread out like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be fit together. Clara's hands rested on the table, fingers tracing the edges of a faded photograph showing the church from decades ago, its spire sharp against a clear sky. Lydia's voice was calm, measured, but there was an unmistakable intensity beneath. It's as if the years of research had led her to a secret she'd been waiting to share. "What you have isn't just an old church," she began. "It's the physical record of something much more complex." Millford's Methodist congregation was always relatively small, but within it existed what we might call an inner circle, a group that operated parallel to the public church. Clara frowned slightly, trying to picture the idea, like a secret society. "Yes, in a manner of speaking," Lydia replied. Fraternal orders and religious groups sometimes overlapped, especially in the 19th century. They formed what were called hidden orders, organizations that claimed deeper knowledge or spiritual truths, often requiring initiation and secrecy. They held meetings, performed rituals, and guarded knowledge not intended for the general membership. She tapped a page, showing a handwritten ledger. These groups were careful to maintain appearances. On the surface, the church functioned as expected services held, baptisms recorded, sermons preached. But beneath that was a network of activities that went unrecorded, taking place in spaces like your basement corridor. Lydia's finger traced the map of the basement, stopping at the iron door. This door likely led to a chamber reserved for this inner circle. The carvings you found aren't just decorative, they're symbolic markers used to guide members through ritual or access. The key you found fits this lock because it belonged to the order. Clara looked down, her fingers curling around the edge of the photograph. How could they keep something like that hidden for so long? And why? Secrecy was essential for a number of reasons, Lydia explained. Sometimes the knowledge was considered sacred, meant only for initiates. Other times, the political climate demanded discretion. Religious groups that diverged from mainstream beliefs often faced suspicion or even persecution. Maintaining a hidden order within a public church was a way to protect their members and their traditions. She sighed, the lines on her face deepening. Millford was no exception. Historical records hint at disputes, power struggles, not just over doctrine, but over control of resources and influence within the town. Some factions wanted to keep the church strictly Methodist. Others pushed for the preservation of these older esoteric practices. Lydia flipped through more pages, stopping at a letter dated 1873. This correspondence references a fracture within the congregation. It's vague, but it suggests a significant schism. Some members left, others stayed silent. The basement was locked, the order's artifacts hidden away. Over time, the knowledge faded from public memory. Clara thought of the padlocked door, the carvings, the sense of something waiting beneath the church's surface. "Do you think the inner circle still exists?" "It's unlikely," Lydia said slowly. "Groups like these often dissolve or transform, especially as generations pass. But their legacies remain in symbols, in architecture, and in the stories whispered in towns like Millford." Eli, who had been quiet, spoke up from his seat by the window. "So, this hidden order wasn't just about religion, correct?" Lydia nodded. It combined faith with philosophy, social bonds, sometimes even political maneuvering. They were protectors of knowledge, some practical, some mystical. Their influence extended beyond the pews. Clara felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the weight of history pressing down around them. And now that it's unlocked, Lydia met her gaze steadily. "You're standing at the edge of that history. What lies behind that door could change everything we think we know about Millford's past." The room fell silent, the soft ticking of an old clock marking time as the weight of the revelation settled between them. Clara's fingers tightened on the photograph. The church, above, held stories long buried, waiting for someone to uncover them. And now, that someone was her. Late into the night, Clara sat at the kitchen table. The faint glow of a desk lamp, casting long shadows over the yellowed pages spread before her. Eli, curled up in the corner with his laptop, was hunched over a pile of baptism ledgers. He'd pulled from the filing cabinets. What started as casual curiosity had transformed into a meticulous search for patterns hidden beneath centuries of ink and paper dot. At first, the records seemed straightforward: names, dates, parents' names, and the occasional note about the child's godparents or the officiating minister. But as Eli scanned through the pages, he began to notice anomalies, entries where the initials didn't match any recorded families in Millford, or baptism dates that coincided suspiciously with known events in town history. He called Clara over, pointing at a ledger dated 1872. "Look here," he said, tracing a row with his finger. "These initials, MS, JR, and LT, none of them appear anywhere else. No marriage records, no death notices. It's like these people only existed on paper." His brow furrowed as he flipped to another page. "And these dates don't align with regular baptism seasons. They're random, scattered throughout the year." Clara leaned in, squinting at the faded script. The names were common: Enough Mary, James Laura, but the signatures next to them were odd, often accompanied by symbols instead of full names. Of the carvings from the basement wall appeared. Eli pulled out a small notebook where he'd been copying down the strange initials and the dates, like a secret message hidden in the baptism records. She watched him piece together what he'd discovered: the repetition of certain initials in sequences, the odd spacing between entries, the way some names appeared only after a series of symbols. It was clear to her that whoever had created these records had intended to communicate something far beyond church. Attendance.Eli cross-referenced the baptism dates with town records and newspapers from the era. "Some of these dates line up with important meetings or events in Millford's history," he said. "Secret gatherings, property transactions, even unexplained disappearances. Cover for something else, maybe recruitment or signaling." Clara couldn't help but feel a chill at the implications. The church's surface had always been about community and faith, but beneath that it seemed was a network of coded communication, an invisible thread weaving together people and events erased from public memory. She picked up a ledger from flipping through the pages to find an entry marked with a curious symbol, a cross enclosed within a circle. Next to it was a date that coincided with a known schism within the congregation, something she'd only recently learned about. The handwriting here was different, more hurried, almost anxious. "Do you think someone was warning others?" Clara asked quietly. Eli nodded. "Or maybe documenting what was happening without drawing attention, like a secret diary hidden in plain sight." The room felt charged with the weight of secrets long buried. The ledgers were no longer just historical records. They were keys to unlocking a narrative that had been deliberately obscured. Each initial, each date, each symbol hinted at lives entwined with the church's hidden order people who had walked these halls, expression the same fire that had driven her to unlock the church's mysteries in the first place. Together, they were uncovering not just a building's history, reading to be fully understood. The iron door loomed before them, silent and imposing, its surface weathered yet unyielding. After hours poring over the carvings on the adjacent wall and cross-referencing with Eli's growing notes, Clara felt the pieces were beginning to fit together, like fragments of a long-forgotten puzzle. The symbols etched into the stone weren't mere decoration, they were part of the lock itself, a mechanism woven into the very fabric of the door's defense. Clara stepped closer, her fingers hovering just above the carved crosses and geometric shapes each symbol, she realized, seemed designed to be touched, pressed even, rather than merely observed. She looked at Eli, who nodded, his fingers twitching in anticipation. The silence between them was thick with tension and the faint scent of rust and cold metal. "Okay," Eli said softly. "Try this." He pointed to a sequence of 3 symbols, a cross with flared ends, followed by a triangle split by a vertical line, and then a circle enclosing a small star-like shape. The order matched one of the diagrams he'd found in the old texts, an initiation sequence used by fraternal groups to grant access to secret chambers. Clara took a deep breath and pressed the first symbol firmly. The stone gave under her fingertips, a faint vibration humming through the wall. She moved quickly to the next, then the third, pressing each with deliberate pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. The weight of anticipation settled over them, mingling with the cold air. Then came a subtle click knot, loud but distinct enough to echo faintly off the corridor walls. The lock's iron plate shuddered. A slow, grinding sound followed as internal gears shifted after decades of silence. Eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Clara nodded, pressing her palm flat against the door's surface. The vibrations were steady now, the mechanism responding to the input. Encouraged, she pressed a 4th symbol, a diamond shape etched into the stone just below the others. The grinding grew louder, the lock loosening incrementally. Eli urged, eyes locked on the shifting iron. She continued. following the sequence meticulously guided by Eli's notes and her own careful memory of the carvings. With each press, the lock's resistance lessened, and the door creaked faintly, the massive weight beginning to shift on its hinges. After the final symbol was pressed, a deep, resonant clank sounded. The padlock's shackle, which had seemed immovable moments before, gave way, falling away with a muted thud onto the stone floor. Clara exhaled. The breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, escaping in a rush. The door was no longer sealed. A gap appeared just wide enough for a sliver of darkness to seep through, inviting yet forbidding. Eli stepped forward, peering into the shadowed space beyond. "I can't see much," he said, voice echoing softly in the quiet corridor. "Let me get a light," Clara replied, fumbling for her flashlight from her bag. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow passage sloping downward. The stone walls, slick with moisture, the air that rose from within was cooler still, carrying that metallic temps they'd smelled before, sharper now, almost electric. They exchanged a glance equal parts excitement and caution before Clara took the first step into the hidden space. The door groaned on its hinges, the sound swallowed quickly by the silence beyond. As they descended, Clara's thoughts raced. The carvings had been more than art or symbolism. They were a key, a deliberate code crafted to protect something far more precious than mere documents or relics. The order that had called this place home had woven their secrets not only into stone and iron, but into the very actions required to enter. Eli followed closely, shining the light ahead as shadows danced along the rough walls. The passage seemed to lead deeper into the earth, promising answers, but also warning of what had been locked away. Behind them, the door swung closed softly, the lock clicking back into place without the sequence. The chamber was sealed once more, guarding its mysteries until the next person dared to decipher its code. The door swung open with a deep, reluctant groan, revealing a space that seemed untouched by time itself. Clara stepped cautiously inside, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air was immediately heavier, saturated, with the unmistakable scent of dust and decay that only centuries of neglect can produce. Every breath she took seemed to stir the particles that had settled here long ago, making them dance in the light like tiny specters. The chamber was small but solid, its walls carved from massive blocks of stone that bore the weight of the earth. Above, with unwavering resolve, the floor was uneven, scattered with a thick layer of dust that muffled their footsteps, and a faint outline suggested the presence of a low stone pedestal at the center. Around it, remnants of what might have once been shelving or storage spaces peeked from beneath draped cloths that had long since faded and frayed. Clara moved forward slowly, her fingers trailing along the rough stone walls. Each block was cold and damp, bearing the marks of ancient chisels, their grooves worn smooth in places where time had run its course. She could almost feel the centuries pressing against her skin, the weight of countless secrets locked away behind these walls. Eli stayed close behind her, his flashlight flicking over the corners of the room with quick, eager sweeps. He paused near a rusted iron chest tucked against one wall, its surface pitted and scarred by corrosion, but still solid. The chest's lock had long since surrendered to time, the clasp hanging loose and twisted, as if it had been forced open. In the distant past, Clara knelt beside it, brushing aside a thick layer of dust to reveal intricate carvings on the lid, symbols that echoed those etched on the iron door above. She traced the patterns with her fingers, marveling at the craftsmanship that had gone into such details. It was clear these objects were more than mere containers. They were vessels of meaning, designed to guard whatever lay within with reverence and care. The silence in the chamber was profound, broken only by the soft scrape of fabric and the occasional drip of moisture from unseen crevices in the stone. The air was stale, thick with the scent of age and abandonment, yet beneath it lay something else, a faint trace of incense, a whisper of smoke that spoke of rituals long past. Clara pulled a small, leather-bound book from a cracked wooden box nearby. Its cover was brittle, the leather cracked and faded, but the pages inside remained surprisingly intact. She opened it carefully, revealing handwritten notes and sketches, the ink faded but legible. The text was dense and cryptic, filled with references to ceremonies, symbols, and a secret language that hinted at knowledge withheld from the uninitiated. Eli leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the pages. "This has to be connected to the carvings," he said quietly. "It's like a manual lore, maybe a record." Clara nodded, feeling a mix of awe and trepidation. The chamber was more than just a hidden room. It was a repository of history and mystery, a place where generations had entrusted their truths and their fears. The dust that coated everything was not just a sign of neglect, but a veil, shielding the past from the curious and the unprepared. She looked around once more, taking in the heavy stone walls, the faded relics, and the faint glimmers of forgotten light filtering through tiny cracks near the ceiling. The chamber had been sealed off for over a century, and its contents had waited silently, preserved by time and secrecy. Clara felt the enormity of what they had uncovered. This was not just a room beneath a church. It was a testament to a hidden world, one that had survived beneath the surface of Millford's quiet streets and orderly lives. As she closed the leather-bound book, the weight of history settled around her, heavy and undeniable. Eli reached out and touched the edge of the chest. "Do you think anyone's been here since it was sealed?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. Not in any way that left a mark. The dust was too thick, the silence too complete. Whatever this place had held, it had been left to sleep in the shadows, waiting for someone willing to listen. And now, that someone was them." The chamber was larger than they'd expected, the far wall receding into shadow where the flashlight beam couldn't quite reach. Against that wall, arranged in a loose cluster, were several wooden crates stacked 2 and 3 high. The wood was weathered and worn, stained dark with age, the corners reinforced with rusted iron brackets. The crate smelled of must and cedar, the scent thick in the still air of the sealed vault. Clara stepped closer, her fingers tracing the faded markings on the side of one crate. The letters were stenciled in black paint, now chipped and blurred. But unmistakable, SCM, the stencil style, suggested they had been applied with care. The uniformity hinting at an official mark rather than a casual label. She called Eli over, who shuffled toward her with cautious curiosity. "Look at this," Clara said, pointing to the letters. "Do you recognize them?" Eli shook his head, but before he could answer, the soft creak of footsteps echoed faintly. In her memory professor, Lydia Crane's voice from earlier, the name she had whispered with a mix of reverence and gravity. Clara pulled the crate open, the heavy lid resisting before yielding with a protest of groaning wood. Inside were objects wrapped in cloth and paper, carefully packed relics that seemed out of place in such a damp, forgotten corner. She lifted a bundle gently, unwrapping it to reveal a polished gold chalice, its surface intricately engraved with swirling patterns and tiny gemstones set along the rim. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind that suggested a sacred purpose. Eli reached into another crate and pulled out a stack of parchment scrolls, their edges yellowed but intact. He carefully unrolled one, revealing dense script in Latin, the letters flowing in a script both elegant and precise. Clara watched as he traced the words with his finger, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar language. She closed the crate lid slowly, her mind racing with questions. "SCM," she murmured. "Sacred Covenant of Millford." Lydia had explained it was a secretive group, an order that had operated in the shadows of the church's public life. The initials matched perfectly. Eli looked up, eyes wide. "So, these are their things, like treasures." "More than that," Clara said softly. "These objects were part of their rituals, their history, their beliefs. They meant something to them, something powerful." She glanced around the dim room, the weight of the crates anchoring the past and the present. She lifted another crate's lid and found it filled with leather-bound books and parchment packets, some sealed with wax. The symbols embossed on the covers matched the carvings in the basement corridor. The books felt heavy, laden with knowledge carefully guarded over generations. Clara realized that these crates were more than just storage. They were a time capsule, a physical record of a hidden life meticulously preserved despite the passage of decades. The Sacred Covenant of Millford had deliberately sealed away their legacy here, beneath the church. Hoping it would endure beyond the fractures and silences above, Eli ran his fingers over one of the crate's rough surfaces. "Do you think anyone knew this was here?" "Maybe a few," Clara replied, "but not many, and probably none who cared enough to come back." She imagined the decisions made long ago, locking the door, hiding the key, burying the truth in symbols and silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, the dust motes swirling slowly in the narrow beams of light. Clara and Eli exchanged a look, understanding that their discovery was no longer just a mystery. It was a responsibility. The Sacred Covenant secrets were now theirs to uncover, piece by fragile piece. Carefully, Clara closed the crate lids one by one, each snap echoing softly in the stillness. The wooden boxes, marked simply with those 3 letters, stood as silent witnesses to a hidden past waiting to tell their story to anyone willing to listen. The air inside the chamber seemed to grow heavier as Clara carefully lifted the lid from one of the smaller crates. The wood creaked softly under the strain of decades, releasing a subtle cloud of dust that swirled in the beam of her flashlight. Nestled within layers of crumpled cloth and brittle parchment lay the gold chalice, its surface gleaming faintly despite the shadows that clung to the room's corners. Clara's breath caught. The chalice was exquisite masterwork of craftsmanship that far exceeded anything she'd expected to find beneath an abandoned church. Its body was slender, yet sturdy, the gold smooth and polished to a soft glow, though dulled in places by the passage of time. Intricate patterns of vines and leaves entwined along the stem, curling upward to cradle the bowl in delicate yet purposeful design. Embedded along the rim were small gemstone sapphires, rubies, and emeralds that caught the flashlight's glow and refracted it into tiny flickers of color dancing across the walls. Eli knelt beside her, eyes wide with wonder. "It looks like something out of a legend," he whispered. "Like the kind of thing knights would have used in ceremonies." Clara nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the chalice from its resting place. It was surprisingly heavy, the cool metal solid in her palms. She traced the patterns slowly, marveling at the care taken to forge something so beautiful, so clearly meant for reverence. Beneath the chalice, she noticed several parchment scrolls, bound together with a faded ribbon. Carefully, she unwrapped one, revealing pages covered in Latin script. The ink had faded to a soft sepia, but the handwriting was elegant, each letter meticulously formed. The margins were decorated with ornate flourishes and occasional small sketches of crosses, geometric shapes, and other symbols that matched the carvings on the basement walls. Eli leaned over to peer at the scroll, his voice hushed. "Can you read that?" Clara shook her head. "Not all of it, but it looks like prayers or rituals, things meant to be said during specific ceremonies." She pointed to a passage near the center, where the words seemed more deliberate, almost like instructions. The scroll spoke of sanctification, consecration of vessels, and the calling upon divine protection. "The chalice was probably used during important rites," she said softly. "Maybe for communion, or for secret ceremonies. Held by the group Lydia mentioned, the Sacred Covenant of Millford." Eli's fingers brushed over the scrolls, his expression thoughtful. "If these scrolls are instructions, then the chalice isn't just decoration, it's part of the ceremony." Clara carefully replaced the scroll and chalice, wrapping them back in their protective cloth. The thought settled deep in her mind. This wasn't simply a hidden treasure. It was a symbol of faith, power, and secrecy, a tangible connection to those who had walked this path before her, who had guarded their beliefs with solemnity and purpose. She stood, the weight of the chalice's significance pressing against her like the heavy stone walls around them. The gemstones glittered faintly one last time before the cloth was drawn back over them, a reminder that beauty and mystery often come wrapped in silence. Eli looked up from the crate with a quiet determination. "We need to know more about the covenant, the rituals, everything." Clara met his gaze and nodded. The journey they'd begun was no longer about just uncovering old secrets, it was about understanding them, about bringing to light the stories hidden in shadow. Outside, the silence of the sealed chamber seemed almost sacred, the air still thick with the ghosts of whispered prayers and forgotten oaths. And beneath the church, in the cold stone vault, the gold chalice rested once more, waiting, as it had for generations, for someone to remember its meaning. Among the weathered crates lining the chamber's far wall, Clara noticed one that seemed heavier than the rest. Its lid was sealed tight, warped slightly with age, but she felt an inexplicable pull toward it with careful hands. Top open, the hinges creaking in protest, revealing a worn leather-bound book nestled inside. The leather was cracked and darkened by time. the edges of the cover frayed and softened from frequent handling. She lifted the book reverently, brushing off the thick dust that had settled in the creases. The scent of aged paper and leather filled the air, a smell that seemed almost sacred in the stillness of the chamber. Eli hovered close, eyes wide as she cracked the cover open, revealing pages yellowed and brittle with age. Neat but heavy, the ink faded to a soft brown. Though the script itself was bold, the letters looping and curling in an ornate style. Clara began to read. This was no ordinary journal or ledger, it was a confession book, a secret record kept by the church leaders who had governed the congregation through tumultuous years. The entries were dated sporadically, spanning decades, and contained admissions that sent a chill through Clara's veins. There were references to hidden funds donations that had never made it into the official church accounts, carefully diverted to unnamed purposes. One passage spoke of a sum set aside to secure alliances with influential figures in Millford, hinting at negotiations far beyond the congregation's spiritual needs. Further entries revealed betrayals within the leadership, church elders who had opposed the hidden order, whose loyalty wavered, and who had been quietly removed or silenced. The language was careful, often veiled in euphemism, but the weight of the confessions was unmistakable. Clara's finger traced a passage that described a meeting held in secret, where agreements were forged in shadowed halls, binding the church's fate to local power brokers whose influence stretched across town politics and commerce. The author of the entry expressed a mixture of pride and regret, aware that these dealings ensured survival but came at the cost of transparency and perhaps integrity. Eli leaned in, reading over her shoulder. So the church wasn't just about faith, he said quietly. It was wrapped up in politics, power, maybe even corruption. Clara nodded, the implication settling like a weight in her chest. This book wasn't just a confession, it was a testament to the complex and often dark undercurrents that had shaped the church's history. Beneath the veneer of sermons and hymns, a web of influence and secrecy had been spun, with consequences that echoed through the decades. She turned the page to find a letter folded between the sheets, brittle and yellowed. Carefully, she unfolded it, revealing a final message from one of the church leaders. The tone was somber, almost pleading. The writer spoke of fears that the secrets contained in the book might one day be uncovered, urging whoever found the record to understand the delicate balance maintained and the dangers of revealing too much too soon. Clara closed the book slowly, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. She glanced at Eli, whose expression had darkened with the gravity of their discovery. "This changes everything," she said. Eli didn't reply immediately, instead reaching out to steady the crate as if to anchor himself to the present. The history of the Sacred Covenant was no longer an abstract mystery. It was a tangled story of ambition, loyalty, and sacrifices, story that had been written in whispers and hidden behind locked doors. As they carefully replaced the book in its crate, Clara felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. These confessions were more than secrets. They were a warning and a call to reckon with the past, to face the shadows that had long lingered beneath Millford's quiet streets. The sealed chamber seemed to hold its breath around them. The silence, now laden with the echoes of voices long gone but not forgotten. And in that heavy stillness, Clara understood that their journey was only beginning. As Clara and Eli sat in the quiet of their small living room, the confession book resting heavily on the table between them, the phone rang. Clara answered, surprised to hear Professor Lydia Crane's voice on the other end, urgent, careful, with an edge of disbelief that immediately caught Clara's attention. "Mrs. Mason," Lydia began, "I've been cross-referencing the names from that confession book with current records. Some of those families, quite influential ones, are still very much present in Millford and the surrounding region." The professor paused, then added, "It's more than just a historical curiosity. These aren't distant echoes. The legacy of the Sacred Covenant of Millford persists, woven into the fabric of local politics and business." Clara's mind raced as she processed the weight of Lydia's words. They had uncovered a secret that had survived not only time, but also transformation, from whispered conspiracies to tangible power. She had imagined the covenant as something buried and forgotten. But Lydia's revelation pulled the past firmly into the present. Over the next few days, Lydia visited often, bringing stacks of documents and genealogical charts that traced the lineage of the families named in the book. Their conversations stretched late into the evening as they pieced together a web of connections: wealthy landowners, politicians, business leaders with roots in the very church Clara had bought. One name kept surfacing: the Hargrove family. Mentioned repeatedly in the confession book, their name was tied to financial dealings, land acquisitions, and political influence dating back over a century. Yet, in modern records, the Hargroves held seats on local councils, owned key businesses, and were considered pillars of the community. "It's a direct line," Lydia explained one afternoon, pointing at a detailed family tree she'd drawn out. "The power established by the Sacred Covenant's leaders has been inherited, adapted, but never relinquished. Their influence extends through generations, masked by public service and philanthropy." Clara felt a chill at the thought. The church's hidden past wasn't just a story. It was a living reality that shaped the town's governance and social structure. This knowledge reframed everything she thought she knew about Millford. Ever the skeptic frowned. "So these families might have been protecting secrets all this time?" he asked. That Lydia nodded. "More than protecting. They likely maintained control over information, resources, even the narrative of the town's history itself. The Covenant's artifacts, the locked basement, they were safeguards not just of faith, but of power." The conversation turned to what this meant for Clara and Eli. The professor warned of potential resistance, those who might see the church's uncovering as a threat. "You've stirred something dormant," she said. "Not everyone will welcome the light shining on these old shadows." Despite the warnings, Clara felt a growing resolve. The weight of the discovery was heavy, but it also carried purpose. They had been given access to truths long hidden, and with that came a responsibility to understand and, perhaps, to challenge the legacy entwined with their town. Together, Clara, Eli, and Lydia began planning their next steps, documenting their findings, seeking allies, and carefully deciding how to approach the community that had unknowingly lived alongside this secret history for generations. The connection to modern power was undeniable, but Clara knew the church's story was far from over. The past and present had converged beneath the weathered spire, and now, more than ever, the future depended on what they chose to reveal and what they chose to protect. The night was heavy and still, the kind of silence that presses in, making every sound seem louder than it should be. Clara had been sitting by the kitchen window, the soft glow of the street lamp casting long shadows across the small yard, when she noticed movement near the church. At first, it was just a flickerish shadow shifting behind the tall elm trees that lined Pine Street. Then clearer shapes began to emerge, dark figures moving cautiously toward the building. Her heart quickened, a cold rush spreading through her chest. She slipped quietly from the kitchen, careful not to disturb Eli, who was asleep in the next room. Pulling on her coat, she stepped outside, the chill air biting at her cheeks and filling her lungs with sharp clarity. The church loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the pale wash of moonlight. The spire cast a long, jagged shadow across the cracked pavement, and the boarded windows stared back like empty eyes. The figures moved with purpose, but also with caution, pausing near the side door where Clara knew the old entrance stood, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs and fallen leaves. She stayed in the shadows behind a thick oak tree, watching as two men approached the door, glancing around as if expecting to be seen. One carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness in short bursts, illuminating patches of peeling paint and rusted hinges. The other's movements were sharper, more deliberate, as he pulled out a set of tools, a crowbar, and a coil of thin wire. Clara's mind raced. Someone had discovered what she and Eli had found in the basement. Someone knew the church wasn't just abandoned ruins. It held secrets worth accessing. The men worked quickly, their hands steady despite the cold. The lock on the side door was old but sturdy, and after a few tense minutes, the crowbar pried it open with a reluctant snap. They slipped inside, the door swinging shut softly behind them. Clara held her breath, the pounding of her heart filling her ears. She debated whether to call the police, but hesitated. There was something different about these men. They moved with the confidence of people who expected to find something, who knew exactly what they were after. This wasn't a random break-in. She pulled out her phone, finger hovering over the screen, but before she could make a call, the flashlight beams appeared again, this time moving toward the front of the church. The men's voices were low, but urgent words she couldn't quite catch. Eli appeared at the door behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom," she shook her head, signaling him to stay quiet. He nodded, understanding the gravity in her expression. The men disappeared inside, their footsteps fading as they moved deeper into the building. Clara's breath formed small clouds in the cold air, and a mix of fear and determination settled. In her chest, whoever they were, they had crossed a line, one that Clara and Eli had only just begun to explore. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the church. The night felt different now, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. The discovery had awakened more than curiosity. It had stirred forces she hadn't anticipated. Inside, the shadows seemed to shift, and the ancient walls held their secrets tighter than ever. Clara knew the coming days would test her resolve, and that protecting the church's hidden history might mean facing dangers she had never imagined. As the figures re-emerged briefly at the side door, carrying something wrapped in a dark cloth, Clara swallowed hard and slipped back inside her house. The window's warm light offered little comfort against the unknown that had just stepped into the night. The following morning, the calm that had settled over Millford was abruptly shattered by the arrival of a sleek black SUV that pulled up with an authoritative presence in front of the weathered church. Clara was surprised to see it the sort of vehicle more commonly seen in city centers or corporate headquarters than on quiet Pine Street. Out stepped two sharply dressed attorneys, their suits pressed and their demeanor radiating confidence. Born of power and privilege, they carried briefcases and a folder thick with documents that looked both official and deliberately intimidating. Clara had barely stepped inside the church when the men approached her. One introduced himself as Richard Ellis, senior partner at Ellis & Crane, a well-known regional law firm. His voice was smooth but firm, leaving little room for misunderstanding. Beside him, a younger associate, Ms. Daniels, scanned the surroundings with a keen, calculating gaze, occasionally making notes on a sleek tablet. "We represent the Hargrove family," Ellis began, his tone courteous but unmistakably assertive. "Our clients have reviewed the recent developments regarding Millford Methodist Church and the artifacts discovered within its basement." Clara's heart tightened. The Hargroves, the very family Lydia Crane had identified as a key player in the town's hidden history, were stepping forward in person. Ellis continued, "It has come to our attention that you have taken possession of certain items, documents, and other property that our clients assert have been in their family's care, albeit discreetly, for generations. They claim these items as family property and therefore requests their immediate return." Clara exchanged a glance with Eli, who stood silently behind her, his expression guarded but alert. "I bought the church at auction," Clara replied evenly. "These artifacts were found on the property itself. They weren't hidden away for family safekeeping. They were locked in a basement no one accessed for decades." Ms. Daniels interjected smoothly, "Regardless of where they were physically located, the legal ownership has never been relinquished. Our clients maintain a recorded interest in these items, which predates the county's sale of the church property." Ellis placed a heavy folder on the nearby pew, flipping it open to reveal pages of deeds, wills, and correspondences marked with seals and signatures. "Here," he said, "is documentation supporting the Hargrove family's claim to these artifacts. Their stewardship was confidential due to the sensitive nature of the Sacred Covenant's history, but it was maintained nonetheless." Clara felt the weight of the papers, the centuries-old secrecy now weaponized in legalese. "Confidential or not," she said, "the church was sold by the county. I have a legal deed and keys. The artifacts were neither cataloged nor protected properly by anyone until now." Ellis nodded, unfazed. "The county's authority over the property and its contents is contested. This is a complex matter that will likely require judicial review." Clara's throat tightened. The discovery she and Eli had made of hidden histories and long-buried secrets was suddenly entangled with a new kind of power: the law. And in Millford, as Lydia had warned, the law was not blind to influence. Ms. Daniels added, "We are prepared to take all necessary steps to ensure our clients' interests are protected, including legal injunctions to prevent removal or alteration of these items." Clara glanced at Eli, who met her gaze steadily. The fight ahead was no longer about uncovering history. It was about safeguarding it against forces determined to control the narrative. Ellis gave a final nod. "We hope this can be resolved amicably, Mrs. Mason. But our clients will not hesitate to assert their rights fully." With that, the attorneys gathered their documents and retreated to their vehicle, leaving behind a silence that seemed heavier than before. Clara stood alone in the shadow of the church, the morning sun filtering weakly through stained glass, casting fractured colors on cracked stone. The battle for the church's secrets was no longer just hers, it had become a struggle against the very legacy the Sacred Covenant had sought to protect in secrecy. As she turned to rejoin Eli, Clara felt the weight of that legacy settle over her once more. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught, but there was no turning back. The hidden history of Millford was awake now, and it demanded reckoning. The weight of the confrontation with the law firm lingered heavily in Clara's mind as she sat across from Professor Lydia Crane in the university's small, book-lined office. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting a soft glow on stacks of documents, legal texts, and historical records scattered across the table. Both women were deep in discussion, their voices low but urgent, weaving together the threads of history, law, and strategy. Lydia had been a pillar of support since the arrival of the attorneys, her expertise extending beyond academic knowledge to a practical understanding of preservation law and heritage protection. "There are statutes designed specifically for situations like this," she explained, tapping a page in a thick legal tome. "Historical preservation laws can provide a strong legal framework to protect properties and artifacts of cultural significance, even when ownership is contested." Clara listened intently, the promise of protection offering a fragile but vital beacon amidst the storm of legal threats. "So the church and its contents could be secured as a public trust?" she asked. "Exactly," Lydia replied. "By invoking these laws, we can petition the state to recognize the church not only as a historic structure, but as a repository of irreplaceable heritage. This designation would impose restrictions on removal or sale of artifacts, ensuring they remain accessible for study and public benefit. The process would not be simple nor swift. They would need to compile exhaustive documentation, gather expert testimonies, and present a compelling case that the church and its hidden contents held significance beyond private interests. But Clara was resolute. She understood that preserving history meant more than safeguarding objects. It meant protecting stories, truths, and identities that shaped the community. They began to prepare. Clara meticulously cataloged each artifact, photographed carvings, and organized the confession, book, ledgers, and scrolls. Lydia coordinated with local historians, archivists, and legal advisors, forging a network of allies ready to defend the church's legacy. Word spread quickly through Millford, stirring curiosity and apprehension. Some townsfolk welcomed the effort, seeing the church as a symbol of shared heritage. Others were wary, whispering about the power wielded by families tied to the Sacred Covenant and the influence they still held. Clara found strength in the support of unexpected quarters neighbors who remembered the church's faded glory, teachers eager to incorporate its history into curricula, and students inspired by the mystery unfolding beneath their feet. Yet the shadow of opposition loomed large. The law firm representing the Hargroves issued statements asserting their intent to challenge any claims, making clear that the fight over control would be hard-fought and relentless. Amid the legal battles, Clara often returned to the church itself, standing quietly in the sanctuary or descending into the sealed basement. The weight of the past pressed upon her, but so did the hope that, through preservation, the church could become a place of learning and reflection, rather than secrecy and silence. One evening, as she stood beneath the choir loft, she met Eli's steady gaze. "We've come this far," he said softly, "but I know this is only the beginning." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words. The secrets locked away in the stone and iron were no longer hers alone. They belonged to the town, to history, and to those who sought to understand the delicate balance between power and preservation. Clara's decision was clear: to protect the church and its contents for the public good, to ensure that the stories hidden in the shadows were brought into the light with respect and care. The battle for control would continue. But so would the journey to honor the past and shape a future where truth could finally be shared. As the first official paperwork was filed to designate the church a protected historic site, Clara felt a surge of resolve. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenge, but she would face it with unwavering determination. The church had been silent for too long. Now, its voice was rising in. She would help carry its story forward.